Exchange from the outside world. Security, certificates, name resolution, and auto-discovery. Okay, so this is yet another one of those topics that really introduces the entire end-to-end approach, or the solutions-oriented approach to your entire Exchange organization. Throughout this entire series of nuggets, we've gone through an incremental approach towards creating a fully functional Exchange organization. We started with mailbox servers, we added in client access, we did the hub transport stuff, we did edge transport, and now we kind of need to tie all the pieces together so that you can correctly connect to your Exchange organization from the outside world. Up until this point, any of your Outlook clients or any of your clients on the inside are going to have no problems actually connecting in and working with your Exchange organization. But there are a couple of extra things that you have to be aware of when you want those clients to be able to communicate with that Exchange organization from out on the internet. Now, this process is different than the process you'll go through for actually securing your Exchange organization against inbound mail and the problems associated with inbound mail. We talked about a lot of that with the edge transport role. These are the other things that you have to be aware of so that your clients can actually work with your Exchange organization from the outside world. In doing that, you need to have a certain set of things that you've put together in order to correctly preserve the environment and protect it against those outside connections. Not the least of which is obviously some security things, and we're going to talk about that in this nugget. We're going to talk also about the Windows firewall and just making you aware of what the ports are that you should know need to be opened up for all the different communications involved in an Exchange organization, and also locking down that Exchange organization using a tool called the Security Configuration Wizard. There are also some certificate requirements as well. There are a number of certificates required for Outlook Anywhere, for ActiveSync, for Outlook Web App, and also, although it's out of the scope of this series, doing SMIME and encrypted mail. There are some certain certificates which we'll talk about called subject alternative name certificates, which can provide you multiple, more or less multiple DNS zones in a single certificate. You also have to make sure you be conscious of name resolution, because the name resolution from the outside world is going to be somewhat different than the name resolution you're going to have in the inside world. And you may end up needing to create multiple DNS servers and multiple zones to support your clients being able to move in and outside of your organization. And then lastly, we're going to talk about this concept of auto-discovery, which is a somewhat complex topic because what it allows you to do is essentially have those clients automatically locate your server, whether they're inside your organization or outside of your organization. We've already seen auto-discovery at work when we were looking at the client access server role, when we looked at Microsoft Outlook and how Outlook could automatically locate the correct information for that user. We're essentially going to expand this now so that when the client moves not only from the inside but moves to the outside world, they'll continue to be able to auto-discover your settings from any internet presence. Now, we obviously can't start any sort of outside world conversation without talking about security. And security is almost a perfunctory topic these days. You know, security is making sure that you have the right patches on your server. And really, when you have a service that can be connected to from the outside world, this idea of ensuring your updates is exceptionally important. Because users anywhere out there in the world can access that server, you have to be absolutely sure that you have the governance of the necessary security patches and updates so that you will eliminate all of those potential vulnerabilities before they can even occur. The second step in this is to ensure that your external firewalls and also the internal firewalls between your DMZ and your internal network are configured correctly so that they lock down to just the ports that are necessary for communication from the outside world to the inside world. Now, one thing that you may want to take a look at is a document called the Windows Firewall Port Reference. And I really don't want to spend a lot of time here talking about all the different ports that are required because there is a substantial number of ports that are required to simply make Exchange run. If you have host-based firewalls inside of your internal network, you're probably aware of most of these ports and are going to have to create those exclusions. Now, by default, there are a number of Windows firewall rules that are created by Exchange 2010 during the setup process, and I'll just scroll through some of these. If you're planning on taking that Exchange exam, I would be very aware of what some of these default ports are, as well as what the port requirements are for the individual protocols that are involved in an Exchange organization, like POP and IMAP and SMTP, etc. So be conscious of these ports in your implementation. Now, obviously, having the right security patches is one thing, and having the right firewall ports is another, but there are also additional configurations that need to be locked down and more or less tuned to ensure that you have the least surface area for potential impact by a would-be attacker. Now, one of the other tools that you need to be aware of that can reduce the surface area of that server is the Security Configuration Wizard. And the Security Configuration Wizard is a tool that's available on every Windows Server 2008 computer, and it can provide a mechanism to identify the different components that are needed on your server, and then to also lock those down that are not necessary. You're aware of all the different services that are installed to any particular Windows server, and how a lot of those services aren't really completely necessary for every environment. Well, the Security Configuration Wizard, in and amongst all the other things it can do, can help you lock down those services to again protect that server and reduce the amount of surface area it has pointed towards the outside world. You'll see here we're taking a look at the Server Manager here on EX1, and inside of Server Manager, if we scroll down here, we'll see the Run Security Configuration Wizard link. What this does is it brings forward the Security Configuration Wizard and allows you to identify really what is currently installed on your computer today. The first thing that's necessary is to create a new security policy. Now, what the Security Configuration Wizard does with this security policy is it identifies all of the different configurations that are currently on your server and processes them in relation to a security configuration database. This database includes all of the suggested recommendations for different service configurations and port configurations and all the other things that could potentially be configured on a base installation of Windows Server 2008. We can actually take a look at this configuration database here if we want. It provides some information about server roles and client features and administration, other options and firewalls, and really tells us more or less for each of these services that are out there, well, what is the information associated with them? What are the required services and roles in order to have a particular role out there? And then also, what are the statuses associated with those server roles? You can scroll through here to identify just what's currently on your server and also some interesting bits about what those pieces are. Once you've known what that database is, you can then compare your server against the database to lock down that server role by role, feature by feature, service by service, etc. Take a look here. Here are the install roles that are currently on this server. Application Server Foundation, for example. Here are also the installed features. Here are the installed options as well. And then also the additional services that are required just so that server can operate. The idea here is that if it identifies the services that are required for your server to operate, it can then go through and identify which of the services are not specified and which can potentially be turned off. You'll see here are some of the suggestions associated with change services that you may want to do on this server. And then we go on to things like network security and firewall security and things like that. So be conscious of the Security Configuration Wizard because it provides an excellent mechanism for you to, again, tune that specific server to how it can be best protected against outside attack. Certificates are also an important addition to a server that connects to the outside world because certificates provide a mechanism to encrypt data and to also provide a source of authentication for clients and servers that are attempting to connect to each other. Now, all clients and servers, whenever they have some sort of connection, have some sort of authentication that really occurs. Inside of your Windows domain, that authentication occurs through the Kerberos service. Kerberos transparently ensures that a client and a server can authenticate to each other before they actually communicate. But out on the internet, Kerberos doesn't really function in the same way. What you need to have is some sort of mechanism to provide that authentication when you don't have this nice transparent mechanism under the covers. Exchange has a number of different certificates and a number of locations where you can install those certificates so that it can complete that authentication and also prove that it is the Exchange server that you want to connect to. Those certificates can be used for Outlook Anywhere and ActiveSync and Outlook Web App. Those certificates can also be used to provide a sense of encrypted mail. Now, what's interesting is that the certificates used for authentication for the first three here provide a mechanism for authenticating the server to the client. This is a different form of certificate than what is used by an individual user for encrypting their mail. And in order to do those user-based certificates for mail encryption, you probably are going to have a PKI installed in your organization and then set up enrollment of certificates to the individual users so that they can have encrypted mail. This is a complex topic. And actually including or creating a PKI and distributing certificates to your individual users is a bit beyond the scope of the configuration exam and also this series. But be aware that there are certificates out there that are probably going to require some sense of a PKI if you want to do encrypted mail. However, these other three mechanisms here can be done through a simple server certificate. Now, what you can see here is that there are a number of different locations where these can occur. If you have a website that you want to provide for Outlook Anywhere or for Exchange services, that may be the same website you want to do for ActiveSync or for Outlook Web App, for example. The Autodiscover functionality also has its own website. Now, these can potentially have different URLs, or they can have the same URL. Remember that a certificate is specifically tagged to a specific URL that the user is attempting to come to. And so if you have different URLs, but you want to use the same certificate, there is this concept of a subject alternate name certificate, which is essentially kind of like a star certificate or a wildcard certificate. What it does is if you want to have autodiscover.company.com and outlookanywhere.company.com and activesync.company.com, you can have all of those contained within a single certificate and install that single certificate to your server. It reduces the amount of administrative overhead required to actually go through the certification process. Now, Exchange includes a very nice Exchange certificate wizard to help you identify what your certificate needs are going to be. If we take a look back here at our server and we bring up the Exchange Management Console, I'm going to look here at Server Configuration, Client Access, and I'm going to look at this particular server, EX1 Nugget. If I right-click, if I go here and right-click on EX1 Nugget under Server Configuration, you'll see I have the option to choose New Exchange Certificate. Now, what this provides me is a way to identify what my Exchange certificate requirements are based off of the different applications that I've installed to this Exchange organization. Let's just call this my certificate to give it a name at this point. What I need to do is provide a domain scope here which identifies where I want to apply this certificate to. Do I want to supply the certificate to a particular domain and or all of the subdomains associated with this domain? So if in this case, do I want to enable a wildcard certificate? For example, star.nuggetlab.com. Clicking the next button here gives me some information about that certificate. Maybe it's Nugget Lab in the organizational unit business in the country United States, in Denver, in Colorado. And then also, do I want to provide a certificate request file path for where I want to drop this request file? Now, what this is doing, what this wizard does, is it provides a cert REQ. What it does is it provides a certificate request file that I can then hand to either a public CA or to an internal CA so that I can create the certificates that I need. You'll notice down here that a number of steps are presented. I have created a certificate request file. What I need to do is then provide that certificate request file to some certification authority to actually get the certificate back that I need. The certificate request file here I've actually stored on the desktop. Here's the certrec.req file, and you can potentially even open this in Word, for example, or WordPad, to actually take a look at what's in the certificate request file. You'll notice it's a set of encrypted text. Now, handing this certificate request file to either, again, a public CA or my internal CA will generate the necessary certificates based off of what Exchange services need. This is a great way, again, for helping you identify what sort of certificates you're going to need so that you have it for all the services that you've created. Again, like Outlook Web App, like ActiveSync, etc. Once you've got that certificate back, you can go back to the server and actually import in the Exchange certificate. Now, at this point, you're going to get a certificate back in a PFX file format and also have, in many cases, have a password associated with that certificate. If you enter that certificate in here and the password and then select the servers you want to target the certificate to, Exchange will then distribute those necessary certificates out so that they're correctly configured for your needs in your organization. So be aware of this Exchange certificate wizard because, again, it provides a very good way for identifying what those specific SSL certificates are that you're going to need to be successful with the various applications you've installed. Name resolution is another topic that we've actually talked about in a couple of nuggets in the past, but it's important here because name resolution from the outside world is not necessarily always the same as name resolution from the inside world. Let's take a look at a sample organization here similar to the one we've been working with before. Here in our internal network, we have nuggetinternal.org. That's the internal domain name for this environment. Now, out to the outside world, we are actually presenting ourselves as nuggetlab.com. Now, in order for us to be able to have seamless transition for our clients between the inside and the outside world, we're going to have to ensure that our external DNS services report to nuggetlab.com while our internal DNS services report to nuggetinternal.org. At the same time, we need to make sure that we have the correct IP addresses associated with both of these so that when a client moves from inside to outside, they'll be able to connect to and work with the correct servers for the services that they need. Now, if you recall, whenever you were looking at some of the services here inside of our Exchange Management Console, if you remember, a number of these services had a location where we could identify not only the internal but also the external websites or URLs associated with various services. For you to be able to have the correct connectivity from the outside world, you not only need to have the necessary DNS services set up, but also those services need to be listening on the correct external and internal URLs. Now, in this case, this might be nuggetinternal.com, where this is nuggetlab.com on the outside world. This is the case for Outlook Web Access. This can be the case for Exchange ActiveSync. Any of these services that are necessarily going to be made available from the inside as well as the outside not only need to have the proper DNS records available so that you can actually connect to them and resolve their names, but they also need to be listening on those addresses by populating these external URLs. So be aware of those, again, of those name resolution issues. One other important point that you have to be conscious of when it comes to name resolution issues has to also do with certificates. Now, I mentioned before that there are a number of locations that you may actually need to install certificates for various services. And I also said that you may want to actually separate out the fully qualified domain names for those individual services. In some organizations, you may want those services to extend to the outside world, and when they do, their names will actually be different. You'll see if we have some sort of client access server in the inside world that actually needs to be connected to also by the outside world, that client access server is going to have to resolve to both nuggetlab.com as well as nuggetinternal.org. At the same time, whatever certificates you've installed to that server need to correspond to both the external and internal namespaces for those servers. This is another good situation where subject alternate name certificates can come in handy because they can again provide multiple namespaces within a single certificate. Now, this entire conversation on certificates and name resolution brings us to the last point here, which is related to Autodiscovery. Obviously, you want to create the most seamless user experience for your users as you can. And one of the ways that you can do that is by providing a service that exists out in your perimeter that is listening for inbound client requests. Microsoft's clients are automatically configured to search for that service, that Autodiscovery service, based off of a set of known URLs. Those URLs can be your fully qualified domain name / Autodiscover, or it can be autodiscover.yourfullyqualifieddomainname.com. If you have the necessary DNS resolution out in the perimeter, and you also have this service that is listening for Autodiscovery information, you can then populate those Outlook clients when they're out in the world with all the necessary information they need to create the connection and to work with that connection. Creating Autodiscovery can be somewhat of a challenging topic, and I want to pace you through some of the steps in here, but really Autodiscovery is going to be very specifically based on your individual configuration. Doing Autodiscovery requires a couple of different steps. Number one is to actually configure the Autodiscover virtual directory on your externally facing client access server. This essentially creates that virtual directory so that users and the outside world, their applications can then access that virtual directory to find more information about connection. Once you've done that, you also have to include those Autodiscovery DNS records. Thirdly, you have to configure the service virtual directories. And you'll find that there are a number of different virtual directories required for each of Exchange's services. There can be one for example, Outlook Address Book. There can be one for Web Services. There can be one for Outlook Anywhere. And you'll need to create these and create the external DNS namespace for these so that your users can connect in. And then lastly, you want to go and test that Autodiscovery. Let's actually go through the process that you'll want to go through for actually creating Autodiscovery and configuring it in your environment today. Now, all of these steps actually start here inside of the Exchange Management Shell. Assuming that you've created your DNS records appropriately, one of the first things you may need to do is actually create an Autodiscover virtual directory. You'll see here that the commandlet new-autodiscover virtual directory will create that virtual directory for you. You'll see here that I'm actually creating that virtual directory under the website, default website. I'm setting its basic authentication to true and its Windows authentication to true. Now I've already created this virtual directory. You can see it already exists. But if you want to actually view your Autodiscover virtual directory website, you can use the get Autodiscover virtual directory commandlet. This will tell you that for EX1 Nugget we have this Autodiscovery website that's configured with the default website. Now, after you've actually gone through the process of creating that virtual directory, you do need to make sure you have that valid SSL certificate. And we've already talked about how you can go through and identify the SSL requirements, make a request, and then import in that certificate as you see fit using Exchange's certificate wizard. Once you've installed that valid SSL certificate, the next step is actually creating the virtual directories for each of the individual Exchange applications that you want to do for this client access server, this externally accessible client access server. Now again, as I said, there's one for Outlook Address Book, there's one for Web Services, there's one for Outlook Anywhere. I want to show you what these commandlets are. I'm not actually going to run these commands, but I want to show you just the syntax associated with these commandlets so you can be aware of how to create your own virtual directories. The first command here is for Outlook Address Book, and it uses the set OAB virtual directory commandlet. We're setting this to ex1 nugget /OAB. This is again a part of the default website. This is and also setting the external URL to mail.nuggetlab.com/OAB. As I said, this will configure the necessary components so that you have the virtual directory for that offline address book that makes it accessible from the outside world. The commandlets used for the other services are actually relatively similar here. Let me show you the one for Web Services. This uses the set Web Services virtual directory commandlet with the identity ex1 nugget /EWS. Here we're also setting an external URL, and as you can see here, it's mail.nuggetlab.com/EWS/exchange.asmx. Now this is really going to be the part that you're going to adjust, the mail.nuggetlab.com part, to make it equal to whatever your fully qualified domain name is. The third one I want to show you here is for Outlook Anywhere, and the Outlook Anywhere commandlet again looks very similar to the other two commandlets. It uses the enable Outlook Anywhere commandlet against server EX-NUGGET1 and external hostname mail.nuggetlab.com. So these are the commandlets you're going to want to use for enabling those Outlook services to be available from the outside world. The last command you need to be conscious of is this commandlet called test Outlook Web Services, which gives you the ability to test what your configuration is and also whether you're going to be successful with presenting those services to the outside world. So what have we talked about in this nugget? We've talked about the steps that you need to be aware of for actually creating an Exchange presence from the outside world, and how that Exchange presence requires things like security, certificates, name resolution, and also this auto discovery for ease of use by your users. We talked about the Windows firewall port reference and how you need to be conscious of what some of those standard firewall ports are going to be. We talked about reducing the attack surface of your individual servers by using the Security Configuration Wizard. We also talked about certificates and the various certificate requirements for Exchange's different applications, and how some of those certificates can be encapsulated into a subject alternate name certificate just to make things easier from an administrative perspective. We talked about the needs for name resolution both inside and outside, and also how you can configure auto discovery to make your clients automatically find your services when they're out on the internet. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.